She sat alone at the market folding poppies in silence. Most walked past until one Marine finally stopped to look. He wore his dress blues with pride, but carried a weight no one saw, until a paper flower brought his war back to life. In front of a silent crowd, the Marine dropped to his knees, because the woman before him once saved his life. Veterans stood in line, children left thank-you notes. The woman they once ignored had become someone unforgettable. She still folds poppies, now surrounded by soldiers who listen, because silence once held the story that saved them. Every Sunday morning, in a sleepy coastal town where the fog rolled in thicker than the foot traffic, an elderly woman named Margaret Ellis sat quietly at the edge of the weekend market. No sign, no small talk, no prices listed. Just a folding chair, a wooden crate, and a worn table covered in handmade paper poppies. She never spoke unless spoken to. Her clothes were plain, gray cardigan, sun-faded skirt, boots scuffed with age. Her only decoration, a single crimson poppy pinned just above her heart. To the locals, she was simply the Poppy Lady. Some assumed she was mute. Others thought she might be homeless. A few younger vendors called her the War Ghost behind her back, joking about her solemn presence and thousand-yard stare. But she never reacted. Just kept folding flowers one by one, with a kind of reverence that made even the most indifferent shoppers pause, if only for a moment. Each poppy she handed out came with a tiny folded card tied with twine. Most didn't bother to open it, but those who did found the same message, written in neat, careful script. For those we must never forget. No one knew where she came from. No one knew where she went when the market packed up. She appeared at dawn, disappeared by dusk, and always left behind an empty chair and a trail of red petals caught in the breeze. Children asked her questions. She smiled but said nothing. Veterans sometimes gave her a nod. She returned it with a quiet hand to her heart. Margaret Ellis was invisible in all the loudest ways, and yet, without speaking a word, she made sure the memory of sacrifice whispered through the stalls every single Sunday. But what no one knew, what not even Margaret herself expected, was that one day a single customer would stop, look into her eyes, and remember everything. And the world would finally remember her. It was the third Sunday of May, sunny but cool, when Staff Sergeant Lucas Ramirez returned home. The market bustled with families buying fresh strawberries and handmade soaps, children running between stalls, music drifting from an old guitar amp. It should have felt warm, familiar. But to Lucas, it all felt like static. He wore his dress blues, pressed, polished, perfect. Not because he wanted to, because today was his mother's birthday, and she always said he looked most like himself in uniform. So he wore the version of himself she recognized, even if he barely recognized it anymore. He had just finished laying flowers at his father's grave that morning, a Vietnam vet buried beside strangers who'd never made it home. The years in Afghanistan had hardened Lucas, but the loss of friends, the firefights replaying every night in his dreams, the guilt, none of that showed in his salute. At the market, he tried to blend in, but kids stared at the medals on his chest. Vendors smiled politely. Someone offered him a discount on peaches. He nodded, gave a quiet thanks, and kept walking. That's when he saw her, the woman in gray, sitting alone beside a crate of paper poppies, her hands folded with practiced precision, tying red petals to twine stems, her expression calm, serene even. But it wasn't her silence or the flowers that stopped him. It was the writing on a small card tucked into one of the blooms. For those we must never forget. His breath caught. That phrase. He'd heard it once, years ago, whispered by a battlefield nurse as she pressed a bloody piece of cloth into his hand after dragging him out of a collapsed building in Helmand Province. He was half conscious, half dead, but the words had burned themselves into his memory. For those we must never forget. He hadn't heard it again. Until now. Lucas turned fully, approached slowly, his boots scraping the asphalt. The old woman didn't look up. She simply held out a poppy with both hands, offering it like a sacred ritual. His voice cracked before he even knew he was speaking. "Where did you learn that phrase?" No reply, just a soft smile and eyes that shimmered, not with confusion, but recognition. Lucas stared. His hand trembled as he reached for the flower. And suddenly, it hit him. The scar on her wrist, the same shape, same spot as the woman who saved his life. Her eyes, older now, but the same ocean gray. The way her hands moved, confident, practiced, precise. It was her, the nurse from Helmand, the ghost who disappeared after the medevac. And now she was here, alive, folding flowers in a quiet town. Lucas's breath caught, his knees buckled, and before anyone in the market could understand what was happening, a decorated Marine dropped to his knees in front of an old woman selling poppies and saluted her in tears. The crowd froze. Shoppers halted mid-step. Vendors stopped counting change. The guitar music faded into an eerie quiet as the Marine in full-dress blues knelt before the quiet flower vendor, shoulders trembling. Margaret Ellis didn't move. She simply reached forward, her hands just as steady as they had been on the battlefield years ago, and placed the poppy against Lucas's uniform right over his heart. No one knew what to say. Then Lucas spoke. His voice was hoarse but steady. "She saved my life." A woman nearby whispered, "What?" "In Helmand. 7 years ago, during the night raid. Our building got hit. Collapsed." He looked up at Margaret's face, then down again. "I was bleeding out. Couldn't move. She found me under the rubble. I don't know how, but she did. Tied a tourniquet, covered my chest with her jacket, told me, for those we must never forget. And then, she disappeared before the evac bird came." He glanced at the paper flower in his hand. "I thought maybe I'd dreamed her." A hush spread across the market like wind through wheat. People stared at the woman they'd passed 100 times before, this silent, strange figure who never smiled unless she handed out a flower. Margaret finally spoke. "I never dreamed you'd remember." Her voice was fragile but clear. Her first words in public, as far as anyone could remember. "I wasn't supposed to be there," she continued softly. "I was off duty. Heard the explosion from the clinic tent. I ran without clearance. No vest, no weapon, just a flashlight and a first aid bag." Lucas blinked hard. "You saved 5 of us." "I only remember one," she said, her eyes moist. "You looked so young." She lowered herself slowly onto the crate, her joints stiff, her breath shallow. "After that night, I was rotated home, medically retired 6 months later. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want the recognition. I just needed to keep honoring the ones we lost." Someone in the crowd stepped forward. A vendor named Eileen who had watched Margaret every Sunday for years. "You've been sitting here all this time, folding poppies, never asking for anything." Margaret smiled faintly. "I didn't want anyone to forget them." A teenage boy raised his phone to film, but an older man behind him gently pushed it down. "Not now, son." It was sacred. Lucas stood slowly, still holding the poppy in one hand. He turned to the crowd and said, "This woman is the reason I came home. She's the reason my mother got her son back, the reason I got to bury my father with honor." He turned back to Margaret and said it so everyone could hear. "I serve because of you." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes bright. "Then I did my job." And that's when something extraordinary happened. One by one, veterans began stepping out from the crowd. Some old, wearing hats from Korea or Vietnam. Some younger, with service pins on their jackets. A woman with an army tattoo. A man in civilian clothes whose stiff posture gave him away as former infantry. They lined up quietly in front of her table, and each one knelt, saluted, or placed a hand over their heart. Not for the paper flowers, not for the booth, but for the woman who had carried the memory of their fallen brothers and sisters when no one else did. For the nurse who came home and asked for nothing. For the ghost of Helmand who'd lived silently among them, until her truth was pulled into the light by the very life she saved. By Monday morning, the story had already spread far beyond the market. A photo, captured by someone at the edge of the crowd, showed a Marine in dress blues kneeling before an elderly woman, holding a paper poppy over his heart. It was shared thousands of times, captioned simply, "He saluted her in tears." Veteran communities online identified her within hours. Margaret Ellis, former U.S. Army combat nurse, served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, medically retired after sustaining injuries in a night raid in Helmand Province. Commendations classified. No medals ever claimed. Reporters came looking for interviews, but she declined them all. She returned to the market the following Sunday. Same chair, same crate, same silent folding of flowers. But something had changed. This time, she wasn't alone. A hand-painted sign stood beside her table. In honor of those who served and those who remember. Local veterans took turns sitting beside her. Not to talk, just to be there. A quiet kind of honor guard. Lucas came back too, this time in civilian clothes, helping carry her table, arranging her seat, handing out poppies. People stopped pretending not to notice her. They came to thank her, to hug her, to cry. A man approached with his young daughter and whispered, "I told her about you. She made a card." The girl handed over a crayon drawing of a poppy and said, "Thank you for saving heroes." Margaret's eyes glistened, but she still said little. Her silence was never from shyness, it was from reverence. Every poppy she folded still carried that same message, for those we must never forget. Only now, people were reading them. Only now they finally understood. The woman they once overlooked had carried more weight than anyone could imagine. Grief, guilt, memory, and most of all, duty. Not the kind printed on certificates, but the kind you live, quietly, for the rest of your life. 2 weeks after the market moment, Margaret Ellis received a letter she never expected. It came from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Hand-signed, not printed. Inside was not a medal or certificate, but a single line handwritten at the bottom. "Some heroes wear silence like armor. Thank you for never letting us forget." She never put it on display. Instead, she slipped it into a notebook where she kept the names of every fallen soldier she'd known, some from war zones, some from years long past. It belonged there, among memories. The following Sunday, she folded poppies as always, but this time the table beside her held a second crate, filled not with flowers, but with messages, cards, drawings, letters, from school children, from veterans' families, from strangers across the country. And yet, Margaret said little. She didn't need to, because the Marine who once saluted her now stood behind the booth every week, telling her story to anyone who asked. Not for attention, but because some stories live longer when passed through the hands of those they saved, and sometimes the quietest people leave behind the loudest echoes, if someone finally stops to listen.